All right, there we go. That looks like we are live now. I'll just wait for everyone to start filing in. Let's just go ahead and add a link to Twitter here so everybody can find it. All right. Hello, hello. How's everyone doing today? Can everyone hear me? Any problems with the stream? Please let me know. This is my first ever live stream, so welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm just here to do a little cozy stream on a Thursday afternoon here. I'm in the mood because I've been simply reading prodigious amounts of literature for the last week and was in the mood to talk about something. Although this is not something I've read this week. This is something I read previously. But hello, American populist. How's it going? Welcome. Yeah. So this is a bit of a just impromptu stream here, and I wanted to talk about this book, which is a very excellent book about Nietzschean philosophy and how this stuff ties into the modern pagan perspective, if you will put it. There's been a sort of a debate that I keep seeing, and I know Sargon had a stream with Charlemagne and Academic Agent recently on the subject, and that was one of their topics for discussion. And essentially, I just wanted to, talk about this book because it is honestly a book that seems to have heavily influenced myself in terms of, I guess, the coming spiritual revolution, if you will. She doesn't use the term spiritual revolution. That's my term. But it's interesting because I see that there's a huge problem with Christianity here. And mostly it has to do with the inbuilt view of what Nietzsche called slave morality. And if you're in the dissident right and you've talked about and thought about these concepts, one of the major issues is that Christianity, in terms of its view of slave morality, having the first become last and the last become first, is that it's very apt to foster, bio-Leninist style avenues of attack. And it just seems that this pattern, especially in modern late Christianity, is something that has happened over and over again. And I really wanted to talk about this book because it is one of the influential works that has influenced my pagan opinion. So I'll just go ahead and start by talking about the author here. So Abir Taha is the name of the author, and she is of Lebanese extraction. For those who have seen my channel before, you know that I have a big relationship with the Prudentialist, and he's into foreign affairs and foreign policy and things like that. So that was kind of one of the interesting things that I found about this author is that she is actually a career diplomat. She has served as the consul of Lebanon in Paris and as first secretary at Lebanon's permanent mission to the United Nations. She has a PhD in philosophy from the Sorbonne. So that's her educational background. And she is versed in both philosophy and Eastern and Western mysticism. And her claim to fame is that she espouses this very spiritual worldview, and her belief is that man's ultimate purpose is the fulfillment of divine nature and destiny. So she's a very interesting figure just for that purpose. So we can go ahead and get into the book if you want. All right. All right. You guys can comment in the comments if you will. I'd actually appreciate that. I was kind of hoping that there would be a lot more commentary, and this would not just be me talking about things, and people would interact a little more. All right. Let's see here. So one of the interesting things that I noticed in this book is that, and this is one of the things that really, really stood out to me, is that Abir Taha noticed that there is a sort of new coming elite. Let's see if I can find the page here. And that was interesting that she noticed that. And I'm not sure, just from my perspective here, of whether or not that's actually going to be people of our viewpoint, or whether that or not that's going to be somebody else, like, say, leftists, or the globalists, if you will. Here it is. Yes. So this is The Will to Power as Self-Overcoming, the New Nobility, Prelude to the Superman. So I'll just give you a bit of a quote here. All right, so she says, to Nietzsche, self-overcoming, and hence the overcoming of man as a species, constitutes the supreme goal of life and the noblest manifestation of the will to power. Life itself told me this secret. Behold, it said, I am that which must overcome itself again and again. The eternal self-overcoming, which culminates in the creation of the Übermensch, the Superman, is thus the very essence of life. Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, it lies within our nature to create a being higher than ourselves, to create beyond ourselves. That is what drives us to procreate. Indeed, Nietzsche teaches us that man is the animal whose nature has not yet been fixed, and so man is a bridge, not a goal. Self-overcoming involves self-mastery. Men are classified according to their ability to control and master their own weaknesses and desires, and therefore to be the masters, not the slaves of their instincts, in what Nietzsche calls the innocence of the senses. The strongest and most spiritual men, according to Nietzsche, find their happiness where others would find their destruction, in the labyrinth, in hardness towards themselves and others, in self-conquest. An ascetic happiness of that kind, which consists in mastering and not repressing the senses, nonetheless without falling into beastly hedonism, is the distinctive sign of higher beings who live dangerously and experiment. And she gives another Nietzsche quote. The highest caste, being perfect, owes it to itself to maintain this sort of happiness, which is bought at the cost of absolute obedience towards oneself, and which consists of imposing upon oneself all sorts of austerity, of self-mastery and rigor. It wants us to recognize in it the species of men, which is the most worthy of veneration, but also of admiration. Thus, it cannot accommodate itself of just any kind of happiness. So, towards a new synthetic aristocracy. According to Nietzsche, a higher species of men must eventually distinguish itself from the amorphous mass and rule over the earth, so that self-overcoming, which represents the noblest manifestation of the will to power and the law of nature, culminates in the creation of the Superman, supreme goal of mankind. A concept that will be discussed in the third chapter. It is from this new nobility, as Nietzsche concept, that the Superman shall emerge. It is thus the prelude to the new superhuman dawn of mankind, the bridge towards the Superman. It is worth noting that when Nietzsche talks about the masters and the aristocrats, it is mainly and essentially in a philosophical and spiritual sense, rather than in a traditional and or historic sense. The new nobility of higher men destined to create the Superman is an aristocracy based on the greatness of soul and spirit, a synthetic aristocracy of complete or whole men who justify existence and prepare the advent of the Superman, in contrast to the fragmentary men who form the vegetating majority of humanity. So, what do you all think about that? Is that an interesting quote? I found it very fascinating that she keyed in on the idea of a new aristocracy, a synthetic aristocracy. And it just kind of struck me when I read that, that it sounded like a synthetic nobility was more of a, not a natural aristocracy. I mean, what Nietzsche is describing here sounds very much like a natural aristocracy, but a synthetic aristocracy to me sounds more of like what we have here today with the globalists. So what do you all think about that? Okay. All right, well, I guess we can just keep reading. It's a cozy stream. In contrast to the weakening and mediocrization of humanity, Nietzsche believes that an opposite movement is necessary, which produces the synthetic man, the totalizing, justifying man, he whose existence demands this mechanization of humanity, for it is on this basis that he could invent and build his higher form of existence. He needs the hostility of the mob, of the leveled men, of the feeling of his distance towards them. He is established on them, he is nourished by them. This higher form of aristocracy is the future's. The superiority of the members of this synthetic aristocracy resides not merely in their physical force, but mainly in their psychic force, for they are complete human beings, as Nietzsche says. He who believes in a nobility in moral questions also. The whole man, for Nietzsche, is a man who incarnates the supreme degree of will to power, which is none other than the degree of courage, the degree of the endurance of reality, of truth, and the refusal to invent another life as an escape from the suffering and cruelty of our world. This is how the synthetic nobility of whole individuals represents the union of spiritual superiority and the well-being and excess of power, as Nietzsche describes it in Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche therefore speaks of an aristocracy based on innate genius, and not an aristocracy based on heredity, titles, or possessions. When Nietzsche mentions the higher men, the new aristocracy, the lords of the earth, the master race, he talks about a race of higher men. The word race is used here in the sense of a universal higher caste, a superhuman species which is yet unborn, which must be born, and not in the conventional sense. He talks about a species which forms itself in opposition to the predominant herd type. I write for a race of men that does not exist yet, for the masters of the earth. This coming higher caste reminds us of the Greeks and Romans of antiquity who, according to Nietzsche, were part of such a healthy and strong race. But it no longer exists in our age of universal suffrage. Thus it belongs to the distant past as well as to the future, and not to the Christian or modern era, for it could not be born out of mediocre, egalitarian, leveling modernity, nor from what Nietzsche calls bovine nationalism, for this race of masters represents isolated and solitary men of exception. It is a comfort to me to know that above the steam and filth of human lowlands there is a higher, brighter humanity, very small in number, for everything outstanding is by its nature rare. One belongs to it, not because one is more talented or more virtuous or more heroic or more loving than the men below, but because one is colder, brighter, more far-seeing, more solitary, because one endures, prefers, demands solitude as happiness, as privilege, indeed as a condition of existence. Thus Nietzsche keeps hoping that this dispersed humanity, separated and solitary, will one day form a race, a people, and will rule over the earth in order to enable the advent of the supermen that it shall breed. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff. I find it fascinating because it's almost individualist, but it ends up somehow being collectivist in a way. It's like they're so highly individualist, they end up being collectivist despite themselves. Duty Rooster, yes, this is actually a very similar idea to Evelyn's idea of the aristocrats of the soul, actually. And, my reading of Revolt of the Modern World was, I noticed that Nietzsche very heavily influenced Evola. He quotes him quite a bit in that book and in other books as well. So she goes on and says, in this new aristocracy, the synthetic nobility of the future that would pave the way for the Superman, who incarnates the overcoming of man by man, the apex of the will to power, following the self-overcoming of morality or nihilism vanquished by itself. Arch enemy of the reign of the comfort and mediocrity so characteristic of modernity, Nietzsche rejected all old law tables, condemning the slave ideology that is Christianity, and advocating instead a radically elitist philosophy and the vision of the world. Aristocratic radicalism, a doctrine unique in the fact that it represents a third way between corrupt egalitarian democracy and the materialist and leveling socialism of the mob, while distinguishing itself from bovine nationalism as well as traditional aristocratic conservatism through its advocacy of the notion of a new nobility of Platonic inspiration. This new nobility shall be based not on ownership of wealth, property, or inherited titles that one neither deserves nor is worthy of, as the corrupt traditional aristocracy of the past 2 centuries. It shall rather be based on the superiority of the soul, spirit, and the degree of psychic power, and thus on merit and real superiority characteristic of a strong race of men, of the aristocrats of antiquity, who to this day represent the only real aristocrats. Yeah, so Duty Rooster, it seems that she has headed you off of the path there and actually has come to the same conclusion as Evola, where she thinks that the aristocrats of the soul are the ones who are going to be this new elite. Let's see here. All right, so I'm going to go skip ahead to chapter 3 here and look at the death of God, or spiritual atheism, prelude to the rebirth of the divine. So she talks about how, okay, so Nietzsche's atheism, his nihilism, he's using these things in a very postmodernist way. He has a tendency to use those nihilistic and atheistic tendencies to destroy the old religion, but in the same way as the modern woke movement, he's also just simply using that as a way to, get the old pushed far enough to the side where he actually can, put his particular view on things into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. So there's a very interesting quote here that I'm going to read for you real quick. It says, "We thus understand that if Nietzsche killed God, or more exactly, perceived and proclaimed the death of God, therefore becoming the gravedigger of an already dead God, it was out of pity for the figure of the crucified that he refused to venerate. For it is a falsified, distorted image of divinity, a symbol of suffering and a mortality hostile to life, or the will to decline and death. Only a true believer in God, a highly spiritual being, could commit such an act, for this God had become an abomination in his eyes, a denial of life." And that phrase, denial of life, is actually very important for her particular worldview and the worldview of a lot of the people who are of the, I guess, more pagan right. The entire idea of when they say denial of life, or life affirming, or in this case Dionysian versus Apollonian vision of the divine, is they mean that, and at least as far as I can interpret this, is a denial of life is, when you think of Christianity, it has a, hello, how's it going? Welcome. It has Christianity has a tendency to deny people actually living. There's a lot of prescriptions against things, whereas in their view, in the pagan worldview, they would share the Evolian worldview on this, especially on like the sexual mores and things, where people will just live life. It's much more naturalistic. It's much less restrictive in the same way that you would think of Puritan Christianity or Islam or any of the other Abrahamic religions. And that's what they mean when they say a denial of life. It's almost risk averse in a way, just because of how strict it is. So the pagans use the opposite phrase when they're describing their particular faith, and Abir Taha uses that in this book as well, which is the life affirming. That phrase, life affirming, means, okay, and this is my interpretation of what she means, is basically it's almost saying like, live your life, like you're here to, your life is going to be filled with risks, so why would you not just simply live your life? Which is very different from Christian morality, and it almost certainly seems somewhat low time preference, or high time preference, I should say. Seen from this angle, Nietzsche's atheism takes on a totally different significance and becomes a means to reach new levels and new heights of spirituality. Nietzsche rejects the religious, which is historical and dogmatic, in contrast to the spiritual, which is eternal and ahistorical, precisely because the superstitious and dogmatic infantilism of religions has destroyed spirituality, that is, real divinity, which is immanent in man and in nature, not outside man and above life. Nietzsche's spirituality has long been ignored, and scholars have generally only focused on his destructive side, which was nonetheless but a prelude to his great work of creation, his creative and constructive side. his philosophy of eternal self-overcoming, which culminates in the advent of the Superman. Nietzsche's atheism is thus only a means, a tool that this iconoclast, this hammer, this breaker of idols uses to liberate humanity from the millenarian lies of the monotheistic God, lies which led to the nihilism of modernity. Therefore, his spiritual atheism is an attempt to vanquish and transcend nihilism, a process that Nietzsche, as we have already seen, calls the self-overcoming of nihilism, or nihilism vanquished by itself. And she goes on. After having destroyed the idols of religion, Nietzsche advocates a spiritual rebirth and lays the foundation of a new religion, a Naturreligion, the religion of nature, and a Lebensphilosophie, philosophy of life, faithful to the real image of divinity, a natural, eternal, universal religion. The old God is dead, long live the new God. In the chapter of The Will to Power entitled The New Mode of Divinity, Nietzsche writes, "And how many new gods are still possible?" Adding, "It is only after the death of religion that the invention of the divine could take all its luxuriance." Nietzsche, for whom the religious instinct is the creator of gods, thus becomes the prophet of a new form of divinity, God conceived on the type of creative spirits, the higher men, and therefore a God accessible to men, a God that symbolizes the spirit of the earth. Therefore, could it thus be that God is not dead? Could it be that he is resurrected? Nietzsche answers this question in The Will to Power. You say it is a spontaneous decomposition of God, but he is only shedding his skin. He is casting off his moral epidermis, and soon you shall see him, beyond good and evil. To Nietzsche, gods too die, and are reborn, like men. For otherwise, what would there be to create if gods existed? The will to power is essentially a will to self-overcoming, the will to create and recreate gods. Therefore, God shall be reborn in a new form, in conformity with the Nietzschean, Dionysian principle of eternal recurrence and eternal creation. Nietzsche thus becomes the prophet of the post-Christian, post-liberal era by announcing his rejection of both transcendentalism and materialism, and by prophesizing the advent of a new form of divinity. So now, what are the attributes of a new form of the divine? This new mode of divinity, this coming God that Nietzsche talks about, and consequently the Dionysian religion of the future, which should replace Christianity following the death of the God of monotheism, will be first and without doubt a pagan God, a God that affirms the great yes to all things. So as I just mentioned, you're seeing the affirmation there, right? The yes. So they're saying yes to all things, yes to life, yes to living your life, and almost in a way, it's highly individualistic, right? Yes to, you will have to go live your life single by yourself, essentially. We have already spoken of Nietzsche's spirituality. Now we should demonstrate that this spirituality is essentially of pagan inspiration, that is, polytheistic, aristocratic, perfectionist, and Unitarian. A religion of nature, that is, eternal and universal, and more importantly, Nietzsche being faithful to the spirit of the earth. The new religion will be an immanentist, pantheistic religion which distinguishes itself from Christianity by not offering an afterlife in the skies, but instead proposes to elevate man to the divine rank in the here and now, rendering perfection possible in this life. Nietzsche openly proclaims himself pagan and anti-modern when he says, quote, "Let us look one another in the face. We are Hyperboreans. We know too much how we live in seclusion. Neither by land nor by sea shalt thou find the road to the Hyperboreans. Pindar already knew that of us. Beyond the north, beyond the ice, beyond death." And of course, she has a footnote here which says, "Are pagan all those who say yes to life? For those whom God is the word which expresses the big yes to all things." That's another Nietzsche quote from The Antichrist. Nietzsche thus expresses the isolation and solitude of higher spiritual beings in the mediocre and sterile age of modernity by alluding to Greek mythology, which spoke of the Hyperboreans as being the race that dwells beyond the north wind, in Borea, a highly advanced spiritual center which is located somewhere in northern Europe, according to the legend. The Greek god Apollo, according to Greek mythology, represented the Hyperborean sun god. Nietzsche will also clearly declares himself pagan in his famous passage in The Will to Power, which he qualifies as his Dionysian world which eternally creates and destroys itself. Also, the following passage from the same book summarizes by itself what paganism, which is intimately linked to Nietzsche's notion of the Superman, means to him. We few or many who dare again to live in a demoralized world, we pagans in faith, we are also the first to grasp what a pagan faith is, to have to imagine the higher creatures than man, but beyond good and evil, to have to consider all being higher as also being immoral. We believe in Olympus and not in the crucified. Nietzsche preaches the pagan ideal which strengthens life as the highest ideal, a form of religion which would restore human pride. He proposes to start with the aesthetic ideals where the world appears fuller, rounder, more perfect. The pagan ideal where self-affirmation dominates. Superior type, the classical ideal, expression of a happy blossoming of all the principal instincts. Nietzsche thus proclaims himself the heir of the ancient pagan spiritual and philosophical tradition. He praises Manu, the first legislator whose code represents a higher, spiritually incomparable work. He admits himself in The Will to Power that when I consider the world like a divine game beyond good and evil, I have the philosophy of Vedanta and Heraclitus as precursors. Adding, man's highest ambition is to unite with what is strongest. That is the origin of Brahmanism, born in the caste of masters. Thus, it is from Brahmanism and Greek philosophy that Nietzsche draws his inspiration for his new religion, which, as we shall later demonstrate, will be essentially Dionysian in spirit and character. Already in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche wrote, "Dare now to be tragic men, for ye are to be redeemed. Ye are to accompany the Dionysian festive procession from India to Greece." Yet it is mostly the Greek ideal which fascinates Nietzsche, the Greeks whom he considered as the hitherto highest type of man, the pagan ideal par excellence. Of all the races of man, the most accomplished, the most beautiful, the most envied, the most life-affirming, the Greeks. And I consider Greek morality as the highest that has ever been. Indeed, Nietzsche considers that perfection resides in the union of Apollo and Dionysus, the former symbolizing harmony, order, and reason, the latter eternal becoming, the creative affirmation of life. The coming God that Nietzsche talks about will thus be a pagan, probably Greek god, a god with light legs, a dancing god, that is, a god who affirms life, who urges men to bless life instead of kneeling before an idol, a god who urges men to be like the gods and even to be gods themselves, instead of weak and submissive slaves, in contrast to God the judge, the jealous God, the God of resentment, of what Nietzsche calls Judeo-Christian monotonotheism. So, of course, this is a very important pagan idea, right? And this is something that comes from a pagan worldview as opposed to a Christian worldview. A Christian worldview is obviously a penitent man kneels before God, right? The old Indiana Jones quote. Whereas in the pagan worldview, you are not necessarily equal to the gods, but neither are they the stranger. They are not just your superior in every possible way. And it is possible for mortals to, in fact, become demigods, or, for the gods themselves to visit mortals in the actual world and to interact with them in a humanistic manner. Think of Odin, revealing himself to random people in the Old Norse sagas, right? Duty Rooster says, I don't think a new religion could emerge solely through the destruction of the old religion. It would have to incorporate what is still alive in the old religions, as with how Christianity came to be. That is a very interesting point, Judy Rooster, and I have somewhat to agree with you there. And the reason why I say that is, in my view at least, Christianity is, especially Catholicism, seems to be a synthesis of Judaism and the old pagan worldview. And you can kind of tell because Catholicism uses the human form. You know, they actually have statues of the saints and things like that, right? That's a practice which is held over from paganism. So that takes the synthesis of the old way of doing things and keeps it around. Whereas the if taken like literally, as the Protestants and the Muslims take things quite literally, the commandments of the Abrahamic God basically say, no, you're not allowed to have any statues, no representations of the human form at all, right? Because that could be classified as idolatry. But actually, I do have a theory that I'm developing here, which my opinion on this is that Christianity, if it is in decline, if it is no longer the religion that is going to go forward, well, if you have this new pagan religion which is going to rise, as Nietzsche and Abir Taha predict, well, you're going to need to take elements of Christianity. So I would almost, in a way, say that if you're going to take some of the elements of one and some of the elements of the other, just like smash them together, right, to create a new civilization, you can do that, right? And you have this idea in Lord of the Rings, right? That Lord of the Rings is a very paganistic setting, right? It's all of the Norse mythology, but it uses a Christianized, good and evil morality tale and like throws them together and that's kind of why, in my opinion, Lord of the Rings is so popular, is because it synthesizes both Christianity and paganism in that particular way. And also, of course, Tolkien was a huge, as well as C.S. Lewis were huge Catholics, right? However, in my view, I think that the inverse needs to happen, right? Whereas Tolkien is taking the aesthetics of paganism, of naturalistic, Shire, worship almost, and a Christian morality tale. Whereas the inverse almost needs to happen, where we take the aesthetics of Christianity, of the cathedrals and that sort of thing, and start having a more paganistic morality of what these people talk about as life affirming. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that's an interesting idea? Mm. Juge, yeah, you're not wrong. It does have a tendency to lead people towards behaviors which are, you know, individualistic to the point of being, society rending. Apologies, I'm eating some Christmas chocolate here. The new pagan god will be, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra, a Ja-Sager, a great sayer of yes and amen. That is, he will affirm life, this life as eternal, as the only life and the only reality. Nietzsche says in The Will to Power, the essential question is not to know whether we are satisfied with ourselves, but whether we are satisfied with anything. If we say yes to a single moment, we have thereby said yes not only to ourselves, but to all of existence. For nothing exists for itself, neither in us nor in things. And if our soul had once vibrated and resonated as a chord of joy, all eternities have collaborated to determine this sole fact. And in that one moment of affirmation, all eternity was welcomed, redeemed, justified, and affirmed. Nietzsche thus preaches that a Dionysian affirmation of the universe as it is, and not as it should be, a Dionysian attitude towards existence. And his formula for this is amor fati, love of fate. For Nietzsche measures a man thus: what amount of truth bears a spirit? What amount of truth does he dare? Error is cowardice. Any conquest of knowledge is the result of courage, of toughness towards oneself, of neatness towards oneself. This amor fati will enable man to restore the innocence of becoming and to establish, as the ancient pagans, a direct link with the universe, and hence with divinity. For, as Nietzsche affirms, outside the whole there is nothing. He thus makes no distinction between God and the universe, being both intimately fused in a cosmic whole. Yeah, that's very interesting. Right, the meme about the paganism, and I know thinkers like Alan de Benoist have talked about this as well. Of because there's no real organization or structure in that particular religion. It's so it's very difficult to maintain any sort of like cohesion or group, common belief, essentially, in the same way that a Christian or Abrahamic religion seems to be able to do. So yeah, it's interesting because even the pagans still have a lot of differences amongst the little groups and the little sects and things. And yeah, some of them are very much the meme of shiny rock, or basically they're just hippies who have found a different way of expressing their beliefs. Oh, you retweeted the stream. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, you're not wrong, Dora. The route to asceticism is definitely one of the paths that has been talked about, especially when you get to thinkers who are much more spiritually expert, like Julius Evola. Evola talked about the left-hand path and the right-hand path. I forget which is which, but one of them is the path of action, and the other is the path of contemplation, or in other words, asceticism. So it's not enough to just simply have asceticism, though. You have to have the path of action, right? In my view, I would almost describe paganism, indeed all the forms of it, basically. And I haven't done a super detailed amount of research on this yet, but I view like there is a connection between Hinduism and European paganism in the polytheism in the language and all that stuff. So when you get to things like the final battle in the Bhagavad Gita, and you hear, in the heart of action and all this, this cool language, that they use. It's very fascinating, and I think that is one of the real reasons why there is a link between Eastern and Western mysticism. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think that there's so much interest in paganism, is simply because like there's this obvious link there that everybody can look at and go see, and it's thousands of years old, but it still is there, even though that the West has become Christianized and is no longer actually polytheistic anymore. So I find it fascinating. Yeah, the hippie question on the pagan issue is a big one. Although I'm not super bothered by it. I almost view paganism as a civilizational way to create the Nazgul vortex compared to Christianity. Christianity, in my view, is almost like it forces the left and the right apart because it's so strict. So the way to basically, paganism is a civilizational way of saying, okay, well, great, we're not going to be, telling you in the great book about how you can't eat shellfish or whatever, but at least, there's, so there's not the strictness in paganism as much, which is why you can get, I guess, a bunch of hippies. But yes, there does need to be a structure. There needs to be a priestly class of people who is able to, mold those sorts of like wild and naturalistic hippie elements that you see on, the traditional left from the 1960s and 70s. And there needs to be a structure and, a sort of, boundaries basically to get these people to go where they need to go in terms of spiritualism. But I mean, from my personal perspective, I'm not really, the Joe Rogan style, just take DMT and learn the secrets of the universe, man. I mean, I'm not particularly against that, but yes, there does need to be some sort of like priestly caste who is able to lead people in the proper way down that path. You can't just, take drugs and zonk out for like 2 hours and find, Jesus or whatever. you took DMT and turned right wing, Dora. That's fucking awesome. That's amazing. I love that. Oh, that's great. Oh, yes. Good for you, man. Good for you. I mean, maybe that's the secret. Maybe if the hippies all just took DMT, like they'd all turn right wing. It's the secret to the universe, man. Duty Rooster. I'm not sure what you mean by that paganism is a logical progression from a pagan cult. No, I disagree entirely. Paganism is an entirely different religious tradition to the Abrahamic religions. The Abrahamic religions have a very, very specific origin source in the Middle East, and paganism is, at least in my view, the religion of the original religion of the European peoples as of starting in the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity, Dora, where exactly in the woods are you? What country are you in? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. That's a huge problem that um seems to have happened on the left. Basically, is initially, right, um the idea of unlocking the secrets of the universe, man, is like a very, very hippie idea. But essentially, I mean, I think we can all agree that most of the drug usage on the left is just basically a means to have fun. It's not really a way to actually find the secrets of the universe. But that's interesting. I didn't know you were from Brazil. Maybe I did. I forget. Too many anons. Too many great Twitter anons. Okay, I have a very good reply to you, Dora, about paganism. All right, and you're in Brazil, so it's a little bit different, right? Because I view paganism as the proper religion for peoples of, I guess you would say, a more European extraction. Um, so, I mean, paganism is also, for me at least, it's a way of um, having a particular, right, because when you have people who are, at least with the globalists attacking basically straight white males and everything, you have to have a way of having a particular religion. And Christianity, in its universalism, seems to be far too more welcoming of the outsider, because it, of course, wants to convert the entire world to Christianity. So I see that as a massive problem. And I think the globalists are discovering just how outgroup preference to the Christian religion can be. And they're more than happy to exploit that. Yes, Copper Star Nationalist, I am actually alive. Mm. Also, from the idea of paganism, right? And my thing with LARPing is, yeah, okay, if you're in a circle of like 3 or 4 people, yeah, it probably does feel a bit like a LARP, right? But um, um, and if it's not guided, if you don't actually have any sort of like person who is able to guide you, and it actually has a sincerity about what you are doing and what you're trying to achieve with it, I think that yes, it is going to be a LARP and nothing but a LARP. But the thing with LARPing, right, is my view on this is it's a LARP until it's not. Um, you're going to Oh well, Copper Star. I think Copper Star Nationals just exited. um, so yeah, so you're LARPing, and it's a LARP until you can believe it, right? The Christians love to say, like, if you practice the faith, if the belief will come, basically, right? If you partake in the rituals, eventually the belief will come. So if that is the case for the Christians, well, then why can it also not be true for paganism? Copper Star Nationalist. Okay, I did already say this. Um, for me, there is very few differences between um, actual, Greek paganism or Norse paganism. Okay, or even Hinduism, really, because for me, at least, and I haven't, as I was talking about earlier, I haven't done any real serious academic research into the subject. But from my understanding, paganism came to Europe, at least in the European conception of paganism, through the Amnaya people, right? The Bronze Age, Aryan Chad, who came in with bronze swords and chariots, and essentially brought the European languages as well as the European religion, right? So, in my view, all of the pagan religions in Europe are all derived from the same source. So, to me, it doesn't really matter, right? And for me, it also, there's a problem of paganism, which is that, okay, which form are you going to take? Well, I don't really particularly care. If you want to take elements of one or elements of another, they all derive from similar rituals and similar needs. So what does it really matter if you can like kind of take if you go worship in an oak grove somewhere, which is more of a druid or Germanic practice, right? And you combine it with like a fire ritual. Okay, what does it really matter? It's serving your purpose as long as it's done in the proper manner, right? As long as it's done in the manner that tradition would accept, as far as you can tell. Yeah, no worries, lurking variable. Yeah, no worries. This is my first ever stream, so nobody can really be blamed, and it was very impromptu. Yeah, Dora, I get that it might end up with a mismatch, and to some extent, yeah, that's a legitimate critique, I guess. But if it serves the purpose, then absolutely, it's required. And the particularism of paganism in being able to assert your identity spiritually is really necessary. The ability, at least because obviously globalism really seems to hate straight white men. That's the people that the wokies seem to be going after the most. It's a way of asserting your identity without getting into white nationalist sounding politics, right? Because obviously the system that you have now is one in which is very much on the lookout for and has the desire to destroy anything which looks like white nationalism. So spirituality and paganism is a way to be able to assert your group interests through your particular religion, and to be able to do that through organization without getting overtly squashed because you're just saying white people this or white people that. So it's almost a necessity, right? And I feel like the Christians do this a little bit, but some Christian sects do this a little more than others. Obviously, Unitarians are very, very leftist, right? So it depends on which one. And I feel like you could easily build from the ground up with a resurgent pagan style of belief, whereas with Christianity, I mean, okay, you can build your own little church or whatever, but everybody else is kind of the same, whereas that's less of a problem with paganism. Copper Star Nationalist. Yeah, I'm not necessarily against Christianity. I think that there is a problem, however, and the problem is essentially going to be that pagans are going to ask for respect and toleration, and Christians are, especially because the modern neo-pagans are heavily influenced by Nietzsche, are going to be a bit turned off by that. I mean, obviously, when you're taking the Nietzschean position that Christianity is slave morality, that's going to be a source of conflict. And obviously, the Christians don't like any pagan idolatry, right? So that's going to be a huge issue. Yeah, it's fine, Dora. Like, you stream art, I stream, books and philosophy and foreign policy stuff, man. To each their own. But that's what are you talking about, Nietzsche, Dora? I guess in the sort of deconstructionist aspects of Nietzsche, yeah, okay, sure. But if you're talking like, hey, I want to crush slave morality, like, what is leftism other than slave morality? I mean, the Bugman is literally a slave. He wants to be a slave. He wants to be a comfortable slave. So, I mean, he doesn't want to go out of his little village, he wants to stay in his pod. So no, I disagree that Nietzsche was a massive lefty, if that's what you're saying, Dora. No. Oh, we have a Russian viewer. Hello. Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure who you're talking about then. Anyway, would you like me to continue to read some more out of this wonderful little book? It's not very long. It's about 100 pages, so I'll just go ahead and start reading. All right, where did I leave off here? A gay black acid true pagan. I mean, I've seen more interesting things than that, but okay. I mean, I guess that's like the black Hebrew Israelites, right? we was pagans, man. People believe strange things. All right, I'll read. Let's see. It is therefore a monistic, holistic, paganistic vision of the universe that Nietzsche offers us, which means the coming God will be a real God, not an imagined God, not a God in heaven, but an immanent God, inherent in nature, in man, at least in the exceptional man. For Nietzsche, there is no duality between the soul and the body, between God and man, the higher man, between this life and the other. He asserts a higher monism, a pantheism that only the masters possess. You guys are fucking cracking me up. Oh, man. It is a new conception of divinity, or rather a return to the ancient pagan conception of religiosity, whose God was accessible to man and whose gods were men. However, unlike the pantheists, Nietzsche wants to rehabilitate nature by humanizing it, not by divinizing it. To humanize the universe for Nietzsche is equivalent to feel ourselves more and more its masters. When Nietzsche adds that every individual collaborates to the whole of the cosmic being, consciously or not, willingly or not, he espouses an immanent conception of the divine, which transcends the I and the you in order to feel in the cosmic way. Nietzsche rejects the kingdom of heaven, infantile fantasy of the weak and the cowardly, to venerate only the kingdom of earth, a world that is much richer, more real, reserved to virile and complete men. He opposes the divine, which is immanent and polytheistic, that is, the creator of gods, to monotheism's transcendent God. Thus, the new God will not be a God at all, for all. He will be a hierarchical God, for it is each one's religiosity which determines which God he will have. In other words, each has his own God. He deserves his own God, according to his degree of spiritual elevation. That is what Nietzsche calls the great selective thought, the hierarchy of thoughts and types of men. She's quoting Nietzsche again. We need a doctrine strong enough to exert a selective action, strengthening the strong, paralyzing and breaking those who are weary of life. My philosophy brings the triumphant thought which shall finally destroy all other ways of thinking. It is a great selective thought. The races that could not bear it are condemned. Those who shall feel it as the supreme good are chosen to dominate. The same circumstances that cause the weakening of man elevate into greatness the stronger and rarer souls, the circumstances which will enable a strong and higher species to subsist. I mean, in the matter of spiritual discipline, are the opposite of those that are necessary to the industrial masses, to the mercantile masses that Spencer speaks of, that which is desirable only to the strongest and most fertile natures, for that facilitates their existence. Leisure, adventure, incredulity, the very excesses, would necessarily ruin the mediocre natures if they had access to them. And it is in fact that which ruins them. That which befits those is the assiduity at work, the rule, the temperance, firm conviction, in short, the virtues of the herd. It is they who bring this humanity to its perfection. Men being unequal, there are consequently two kinds of morality, but also two kinds of religiosity. two kinds of gods, the God of masters and the God of slaves. Whereas the Judeo-Christian God was the God of slaves, Nietzsche's coming God will be the God of masters. To Nietzsche, the master, the strong man, whose ego wants to beget his God and put mankind on its knees before this God, creates his own God, an immanent God, in his image, whereas the slave kneels before a God that will forever remain a stranger to him, forever unreachable, a transcendent God born from fear and weakness. That's a very interesting point, yeah. And it's interesting because reading other people, other thinkers like de Benoist, they say similar things about Yahweh, in that de Benoist describes Yahweh as the what is the precise term he uses? He says it is the absolute other. Yes, that's the term he uses. So he's saying that Yahweh is a God which is completely separate from this world, right? His kingdom is not of this world. So it is a God that is unreachable in this world, whereas the pagan conception of deistic is I can actually physically touch Yahweh, Odin, or Zeus or whatever, or Zeus can go have sex with some random girl and impregnate her. The gods can actually do things and touch people in real life, whereas Yahweh operates through others, right? These two antithetical gods will always be in conflict, so long as men shall live. Divine man creates his own God, and there is no worse enmity on earth than the enmity between gods. The Nietzschean God will be in the image of Greek gods, who are neither totally gods nor totally men, rather God-men. He praises the Greeks for not having known that gap between divine beauty and human ugliness. The dichotomy between divinities reflects itself also in religions, which all have an esoteric, eternal, and universal side, reserved for the initiated, and an exoteric, historical, dogmatic side addressed to the masses. The inversion of values advocated by Nietzsche thus implies the inversion of divinities, whereas in the era of the Judeo-Christian God, the slave morality predominated. The era of the Nietzschean God will restore the natural order of rank, and thus the supremacy of aristocratic values, an aristocracy of the spirit, unlike the conventional hereditary aristocracy based on titles and possessions of Brahmanic type. The coming God conceived by Nietzsche will not be the God of goodness or wisdom, but the God of supreme force. Let the concept of God far from the supreme good. It is unworthy of a God. Let it also be far from supreme wisdom. It is the vanity of philosophers which has imagined this absurdity, a God that would be a monster of wisdom. They wanted him to resemble them as much as possible. No, God is supreme power. That is enough. From this results all things. From this results the world. This Nietzschean God, incarnation of the will to power, of the inexhaustible and creative will to live, will be a God beyond good and evil. For power, creative energy, always expresses itself beyond good and evil. Nietzsche explains in Ecce Homo that his Zarathustra had corrected the good-evil duality of the historical Zarathustra, a duality which had led to Christianity. The new Zarathustra, alias Nietzsche, is the prophet of a new divinity, a new religion which transcends morality, as power is beyond morality. Nietzsche writes, if we proceed from experience, from a random case where a man has risen sensibly above the measure of humanity, we will see that all higher degree of power implies freedom towards good and evil, as towards true and false. When Nietzsche says that God is shedding his skin and soon you shall see him beyond good and evil, he considers that the supreme good and the supreme evil are identical as long as they beget creative power. The coming God will be a God of becoming, the God of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche considers that if the world had an end, the end would have been attained. Thus, the world, even if it is no longer a God, must, however, possess virtually the divine creative force, a force of infinite metamorphosis. The world, as force, must not be conceived as unlimited, for it cannot be conceived thus. We forbid ourselves the concept of an infinite force because it is incompatible with the concept of force. So this is a very interesting section here, right? And she's talking about, it's almost a very, it reminds me yet again of the Bhagavad Gita a little bit, right? And specifically the last battle in the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna is talking to, oh shoot, who's that guy's name? Anyway, it's been a while. But he's basically, so Lord Krishna is talking, to Arjuna, and he's basically saying, appearance and, victory and defeat, living and death, these things are the same, but you have to act, right? So this is almost a very Eastern way of thinking about this, right? Yes, Copper Star nationalists. Yes, hide your children, hide your wife, because Zeus be raping everybody out there. Lurking variable. I'm not sure who you mean, Julian Janes. This is Abir Taha's work here. Dora, I'm not sure what the concept of the bicameral mind is. Let me write that down so I can research it. I mean, the term sounds like kind of similar to what I've been describing with, Lord Krishna's discussion with Arjuna, right? It's almost like you have to, it's a way of thinking objectively, really, where, oh, I see. Okay. Thank you, Lurking Variable, for, clarifying that. Julian James. He's writing good books. I am in need of good books. I have a book stack that's probably about 40 books long right now, so. All right, let's see. I can stick around for a little bit here. I'll at least finish the chapter for you guys. Yeah, the third chapter is the best chapter in this book, honestly. The first chapter is called The Death of God, or The End of the Longest Error. And then the second chapter is called Beyond the Death of God, Nihilism Vanquished by Itself. So basically, she essentially goes into Nietzsche's deconstructionist killing of God, really, and then saying how, like, okay, well, that doesn't lead to nihilism in and of itself. Essentially, nihilism destroys its own self. So very fascinating worldview. And I mean, I have not really delved too deep into Nietzsche here. I've read a little bit, but it's interesting to hear somebody else's take on it and how they're, a subject matter expert discussing all this stuff in a very spiritualistic mindset, This Nietzschean God, incarnation of the will to power, of the inexhaustible and creative will to live, will be a God beyond good and evil. For power, creative energy always expresses itself beyond good and evil. Nietzsche explains in Ecce Homo that his Zarathustra had corrected the good-evil duality of the historical Zarathustra, a duality which had led to Christianity. The new Zarathustra, alias Nietzsche, is the prophet of a new divinity, a new religion which transcends morality as power is beyond morality. Nietzsche writes, if we proceed from experience, from a random case where a man has risen sensibly above the measure of humanity, we will see that all higher degree of power implies freedom towards good and evil, as towards true and false. When Nietzsche says that God is shedding his skin, and soon you shall see him, beyond good and evil, he considers that the supreme good and the supreme evil are identical, as long as they beget creative power. The coming God will be a God of becoming, the God of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche considers that if the world had an end, that end would have been attained. Thus, the world, even if it is no longer a God, must, however, possess virtually the divine creative force, a force of infinite metamorphosis. The world as force must not be conceived as unlimited, for it cannot be conceived thus. We forbid ourselves the concept of an infinite force, because it is incompatible with the concept of force. Thus, what may seem as an outright form of nihilism, the eternal recurrence of all things, is in fact a supreme affirmation of life, of this life, the only life, the real life, a creative call to perfection in the here and now, and not in an undefined, illusory beyond. Let us stamp on our own life the seal of eternity. This thought is heavier in content than all religions which despise this life and which have taught us to look towards a badly defined life. Nietzsche adopts Heraclitus' maxim that everything is in flux, and opposes the pagan immanentist thought of becoming to the Christian transcendental thought of being. The eternal recurrence is to Nietzsche the only remedy to the death of the transcendent God, given that it enables man to determine his own destiny for eternity. Nietzsche writes, "Live in a way that you would wish to live. It is the duty, for you shall relive in any case. Eternity depends upon it." It is thus a call to explain becoming without passing by intentions of finality. For if everything is determined, how could I dispose of my acts? Nietzsche believes that in order to bear the thought of eternal recurrence, one must be free towards morality, and asks himself, if we eliminate from evolution the idea of an end, would we nonetheless affirm evolution? Yes, if inside this evolution and during each of its moments, an end would be attained, and always the same end. This end to Nietzsche is none other than the eternal self-overcoming, to finally reach the stage of the Superman, that is, the God-man, the God in making, the incarnated God, and not the God in heaven. This Nietzschean God of becoming will also be the God of eternal self-overcoming, of creative evolution, which represents the law of nature and of life. Indeed, to Nietzsche, life, that is, God himself, given his monistic vision of the universe, is but an eternal self-domination, an eternal overcoming of creative evolution, which represents the law of nature and of life. Indeed, to Nietzsche, life, that is, God himself, given his monistic vision of the universe, is but an eternal self-domination, an eternal overcoming. Becoming is thus creative. It never ceases to reinvent itself. From a convinced nihilist to an accomplished nihilist, who has vanquished his nihilism by transcending it, Nietzsche shows us the way to tread in order to give new life a new meaning, after the fall of the old moral world, refusing to adopt a pessimistic and destructive attitude which makes life denial the only goal, as it escaped from the suffering of a vain and futile existence, as Schopenhauer and the Buddhists did before him. Nietzsche, who saw in the will to perfection the last residue of the divine, chooses by contrast a tragic, heroic attitude towards life, the pessimism of force, or active nihilism. He decides to overcome, transcend his nihilism by setting for himself and for humanity a new goal, the Superman, apex of becoming and self-overcoming. However, the law of overcoming implies for man to sacrifice his human, all too human side. To realize a spiritual mutation of his being, he must consume himself in his own flame, to be reborn as a phoenix from the ashes. For the divine in man to be born, the human in him must perish. That is why Nietzsche praises, from the bottom of his heart, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, those who decline, for they go beyond. The higher man is he who aspires after the divine in full knowledge that, as Icarus, he must perish to attain his goal. Nietzsche writes in his Zarathustra, always more numerous, always better must those of this kind perish. Only thus will man grow to the height where the lightning will strike him and break him, high enough for the lightning. This man of the heights, of the peaks, this mutant of the spirit who has overcome himself, who has overcome his human condition, is none other than the Übermensch, the Superman, the supreme goal and apotheosis of Nietzschean thought. Nietzsche's Superman is the incarnation of this new coming God, of the resurrection of the divine following the death of the monotheistic God. The Superman is the masterpiece and cornerstone of Nietzsche's philosophy. He is at once the culmination of the principle of eternal overcoming, of the will to power, and the supreme goal for humanity, following the death of God, the only hope for mankind, lost and without ideals, is the incarnation of an immanent divinity, of the divine on earth, the Übermensch, man's new accessible goal. Copperstar Nationalist, I don't know. I'm sure he would be absolutely horrified. I think, yeah, that he would be just shocked to his absolute core. Although it's weird, though, right? Reading this last passage here about, trying to become the Superman and sacrificing your human, all too human side. There is an element in this, right, where he might actually start to praise, the transhumanist aspects of the modern left. So I really do wonder about that, Although I think if he would agree with us on orientation, obviously yes, he would be horrified. Just simply doing things like body modification and cutting yourself up and that sort of thing to no real purpose is not that's not an improvement, shall we say. I think he would agree with us there. Yeah, Dora, I think you're correct. I think it's not an it doesn't seem to be very narcissistic, right? It's not man worshiping himself, right? The will to power definitely is a phrase that would be something that people like Evola would agree with in terms of having an upward orientation spiritually. Nietzsche considers that the death of God was necessary in order to create the Superman, for the latter represents, in his eyes, the new mode of divinity. The Superman is thus the incarnation of Nietzsche's coming God, whom, as we have seen, is an immanent pantheistic God. Therefore, to speak of Nietzsche's coming God is ineluctably to speak of his human manifestation, the Superman. We cannot separate in Nietzsche's philosophy the concepts of the divine and the Superman. For according to his monistic vision of the world and of divinity, they are inseparable and of the same nature. The Superman is a God-man, and thus a God in the making, a coming God. As we have seen, the death of God to Nietzsche, far from representing the destructive and absolute nihilism of an absolute materialist, is rather a profoundly spiritual event, announced by a true believer in human perfection. Indeed, it is only by repudiating the existence of a transcendent God and the promise of perfection in the beyond that the higher man could be resuscitated as Lord and Master of the earth, as a Superman, a God-man who symbolizes terrestrial perfection, and the new and highest, but realizable, goal of mankind. For man cannot bear life without giving it a meaning. Mankind cannot live without a goal, for if an end is still lacking for humanity, is not what is still lacking humanity? The new goal for mankind, the only hope to vanquish and transcend nihilism, is the divine man. The man who is a god, the god who is a man. God died. Now we desire that the Superman shall live. To you, higher men, this god was your greatest danger. Affirms Nietzsche in his Bible, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. By calling for the creation of a higher humanity, Nietzsche thus becomes the prophet of the Superman as the meaning of the earth, the projection of the will to power, a humanly conceivable, humanly visible, humanly attainable goal, which can and must realize itself through man's creative will, and not an imaginary supposition. God is a supposition. Could you create a god? Could you conceive a god? So be silent about all gods. But you could surely create the Superman. Once you said God when you gazed upon distant seas. But now I have taught you to say Superman. The beauty of the Superman came to me as a shadow. Ah, my brothers, what are the gods to me now? As we have already demonstrated, eternal self-overcoming represents in Nietzsche's eyes the noblest manifestation of the will to power. This creative process culminates in the creation of the Superman. Ich lehre euch den Übermensch. I teach you the Superman, writes Nietzsche in his Zarathustra, who walks among men as among fragments of men, searching for the representative of the new humanity. I write for a species of man that does not yet exist, for the masters of the earth, he tells us in The Will to Power. What Nietzsche means by noontide and eternity in his Zarathustra is that the advent of the Übermensch who returns eternally to his human perfection, to perfect humanity. The Superman incarnates the noontide, the apex of Nietzschean thought for all eternity. Zarathustra proclaims, dead are all the gods. Now we want the Superman to live. Let this be one day, at the great noontide, our ultimate will. For Nietzsche pursues, that precisely is godliness, that there are gods, but no God. And it's interesting because gods is not capitalized, but God is. So, to Nietzsche, the Superman must rule the earth, for he represents the future of the human race. A higher species of man, he is the purest, the strongest. He is perfection itself. He embodies the union between the Apollonian and the Dionysian principles and visions of the world. The Superman is the synthetic man, the artist-philosopher, the great legislator of the future, the union of the creator, the lover, the seeker, in power, the great synthesis of the creator, the lover, and the destroyer. He is a Friedrich Nietzsche, the great reformist of humanity, who imposes his hand over the coming millennium, for he is this predestined man who sets values for millennia. In The Will to Power, his last unpublished work, Nietzsche predicts how the Superman shall speak. I have for the first time united in myself the just, the hero, the poet, the savant, the soothsayer, the leader. I have extended my vault over the peoples. I have built columns over which a sky stands, strong enough to carry a sky. Thanks, Lurking Variable. The Superman, exact antithesis to modernity's last man, represents the zenith of the aristocratic vision of the world, incarnating values that are totally different from those of ordinary humans, from the common and the mediocre. This radically elitist concept of Superman only applies to beings of exception. It is even a species that is yet unborn, as Nietzsche says. Indeed, self-overcoming, and consequently the creation of the Superman, is a goal reserved to the rare, higher, and creative spirits, and remains an impossible dream for common mortals who, according to Nietzsche, have no inherent value. Nietzsche indeed distinguishes between the superfluous, the many, too many, and the very few solitaries, the natural aristocrats. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost, I get a very Nick Landian vibe here when he says, we're going to create a different species. Nick Land was famous for his idea, solution, I guess, to the race problem of just saying, okay, well, eventually somebody is going to go to the stars. So most of this is of the rest of the chapter is kind of the similar themes. She does have a tendency to get a little bit carried away and just say things over and over again and repeat it, when she could have just literally put this into bullet points. But of course, then you wouldn't have a book. So I think I'm going to move on to the conclusion here, because that's only 2 or 3 pages, so I can go ahead and read that for you guys. Okay, I'll read you the... Copper Star. Oh, you're bad. All right, I'll read the last paragraph of the 3rd chapter here. All right, therefore, Nietzsche does not advocate a return to the primitive past. Rather, he says that man is something that should be overcome, even if it is through education, social Darwinism, or wars. Here we find a teleology and a transcendence in immanence, embodied by the Superman, as well as a promise of noontide and eternity. Dionysius is the sign of that which has not yet come, that which has not yet become in a man. He is the god of fermentation, but that which seeks the wine and calls the light. Yeah, Dora, you're not wrong. If you don't have at least 100 pages, you don't have enough to make a book, right? That's not a book, that's an essay. All right, so the conclusion is called The Redemption of the Divine. And she writes, this book's aim was to demonstrate that Friedrich Nietzsche, far from being the absolute nihilist and atheist as he is generally perceived nowadays, was on the contrary a great affirmer of life, whose philosophy was imbued with a strict spirituality that motivated and characterized his pantheistic vision of life, revealing itself even in his most violent and destructive writings. It is true that Nietzsche was, in his own words, the most ungodly of the godless, but his godlessness, which was so characteristic of him, was itself a justified reaction of a highly spiritual being who refused to believe in a uppercase God, who represent the antithesis to life and nature. This is why Nietzsche celebrated the death of this life-denying God, as well as the demise of the morality which perpetuated that tyrant God above the clouds. For this death of a false God was to him a prelude to the birth, or rather to the rebirth of the divine, a real divinity which was intimately linked to man, and not an idol fixed in a beyond, denying all reality and human greatness. Man, for Nietzsche, must aspire to divinity not by kneeling before an idol that will remain forever unknown and unreachable, but by overcoming himself and by creating beyond man, by creating the superhuman incarnation of the mystical union between man and God, a union and a link that monotheism had severed through its transcendent and moral vision of a God in heaven. Nietzsche thus had his own vision of divinity, a coming God who, like Dionysus, would be the God of eternal overcoming, and would thus manifest himself through several incarnations. A God who would be the beyond good and evil, beyond Christian life-denying morality. The goal of this work was to underscore the mystical side of Nietzschean thought, which is unfortunately nearly totally ignored nowadays by most of his disciples and scholars, as well as his adversaries, who, omitting rare exceptions, read him in a superficial way and consequently do not perceive his spiritual and creative side, focusing only on his destructive side, which they consider as being an end in itself for Nietzsche, whereas it was in fact only a necessary but transitory stage which served his great work of creation, the Superman. Indeed, Nietzsche was an iconoclast, a breaker of idols, of fixed dogmas hostile to life and to man's elevation. the first free spirit who welcomed the death of God, which he was the first to notice, not based on an absolute nihilistic and materialistic atheism, but as the death of the false God, of monotheism's moral God, seeing in this divine death not an end in itself, which would represent a perpetual nihilism, but rather a prelude to the birth of the divine, after having shed its moral epidermis. The nihilism which Nietzsche perceived and fought against, using it against itself in order to overcome it, was merely a work of destruction in order to rebuild, reinvent a new and authentic divinity incarnated by the Superman, and not the God on the cross, which is a counter nature and a curse wrought on life and on man. Whew, Christians aren't going to like this language. Yeah. In this sense, the death of God represented at the same time the culmination and the end of nihilism, at least for the higher man, given that it permitted the rebirth of an imminent new mode of divinity beyond good and evil, in contrast to the moral and transcendent God of Judeo-Christian monotheism. It was thus his own faith which pushed, even forced Nietzsche to become an atheist. That is, in this case, to reject the abomination, the moral monster that men call God, who in fact is but a caricature of real divinity, a negation of life, a betrayal of the authentic God which is immanent in nature and in man. Nietzsche was thus an atheist precisely because he believed in the divine, that is, the real God. His atheism was not an end in itself, as is the case for the modern positivists and other skeptics and pessimists. The death of God is itself a spiritual event, a creator of new gods and new law tables which affirm life. It is thus a death which heralds a spiritual rebirth in a deeply Dionysian sense. It is indeed more than necessary to reveal this mystical aspect and dimension, as well as the fundamentally spiritual and creative character of this great philosopher, the great sayer of yes and amen, this anti-Christian atheist, for he is a true believer in life and in the God that is an integral part of it, and not in monotheism, which represents a brutal break of the sacred link between man and God. The nihilistic, atheistic, immoral, and destructive side of Nietzsche was thus not an end in itself, but a transitory phase which was necessary to vanquish and transcend the Judeo-Christian values which themselves had led to nihilism and the spiritual decay of mankind. Nihilism, an evil so characteristic of modernity, was at the same time the cause and the consequence for the death of God, but Nietzsche's spiritual atheism transformed this spiritual darkness into a dawn heralding a new form of divinity incarnated by the Superman. The death of God was thus the consequence and culmination of nihilism, but also and essentially the end of the longest error, that is, life-denying Christian morality, which, by making the world a fable through the invention of an imaginary beyond, had undertaken a veritable inversion of life-affirming values, leading to the absence of any goal justifying human existence. For the pessimists and the modern positivists, this nihilism and this atheism constituted an end, and thus led to a second nihilism, to the perpetuation of nihilism. Indeed, modernity offers no viable, philosophical, spiritual alternative to the death of God, given that it cannot fill the spiritual chasm left by God's demise, the absence of all justification of life, and constitutes a perpetuation of decadence and slave morality through liberalism, its secularized version of Christianity. The slave's will to power, which had inverted the ancient pagan values of the masters, therefore only perpetuates nihilism. As for the master, he is pushed by his will to power to transform the death of God into an inversion of values that are hostile to life and of Christianity's millenarian lies, refusing and rejecting nihilism, represented by the transcendent and moral God of monotheism. In order to transcend nihilism and the death of God, the higher man, who represents an elevated degree of moral and psychic power, and thus incarnates a tragic, heroic, and life-affirming vision of the world, uses this vital principle, the will to power, inherent in life, this morality beyond good and evil, as eternal overcoming, as an active nihilism, or the pessimism of strength, as immoralism to re-establish the natural order of rank and real divinity, supreme manifestation of the will to power, and not the crucified, the God on the cross of the weak and the weary slaves. The Superman thus becomes the new goal of life, the representative of the coming God, incarnated to perfection by the god Dionysus, who represents the religious affirmation of life. And that's the end of the book. So yes, obviously you can, judging from what I read from the third chapter and reading the conclusion, yeah, she does kind of repeat herself often. But I guess some of these concepts are very unfamiliar to somebody who hasn't actually read Nietzsche. So it's almost necessary for you to, have it repeated multiple times. So those who haven't actually, read 600 pages of Will to Power or, anything else can kind of understand the base concepts. What else did you guys think? Did you like it? Yeah, it's almost weird though too, right? I almost feel that when she talks about this elite who creates the Superman and tries to self-overcome, there's a very transhuman element into it that I'm not exactly comfortable with personally. I almost feel that it's something that if it's taken the wrong way, people will do crazy things with it, with that kind of deconstructionist attitude. It's like, okay, I'm going to take the first step to just destroy God and destroy morality and all that other stuff, but then you don't replace it with well, I guess the modern left would willingly choose to not replace it with what Nietzsche would prefer to replace the old God with. So very fascinating work. I find that all of them, the modern pagans, the serious, bookish ones anyway, all have very heavily influenced by Nietzsche, as well as Evola and Heidegger. But yeah, it's a good book. It's only 100 pages. It's a short read. It's sold by Arctos Press, which those guys are pretty based. So I bought them, and yeah. Yeah, I didn't think it was a bit wordy, honestly. Like I tend not to get annoyed with philosophy very much, and since when I read this book, I really hadn't delved too deep into Nietzsche myself. So reading it was a kind of an introduction to Nietzsche almost. So I kind of liked it for that. I didn't think it was wordy at all. I mean, maybe I'm just too educated, I guess. Yeah, you're not wrong there, Dora. Yeah, it's instead of it should be a focusing on improvement, not changing oneself just to get a robot arm, like you say. And I guess you could classify a robot arm as improvement if you're an Adeptus Mechanicus person, but I am not. I think that's not an improvement at all. So, at least not in the current context. Well, hey, you know what? I have no problems with Dirt Road Hicks, Copper Star Nationalist. I am somebody who is descended from Dirt Road Hicks, so I can't really, say too much bad stuff. I'm a generation removed from poor rural white Appalachia, I guess, western rural Pennsylvania. So you can't really, say bad things about people like that in that way if you're one of them, basically. Yes, Dora, you're correct. That is the proper orientation, I think, and the proper attitude. And of course, if you're getting your arm replaced by a robot arm, are you really improving yourself, or are you just attaching a tool? That's a very good way of thinking about it. Although I too welcome our new, cyborg overlords. Anyway, so I just wanted to give everybody a quick introduction to this book, and talk about some of the themes in there. Have a little cozy stream. Uh, and I really wanted to get myself involved into the conversation on Christianity and paganism, because the debate seems to be a constant problem. I mentioned earlier in the stream, the Academic Agent has stream, where they were talking about, Christianity and paganism is one of the fault lines that appear on the right. And so I wanted to be able to throw my voice out there on what my personal beliefs were, and, the things, I guess you would say, the moral sympathies that I hold, and see if I could kind of at least put out a good case for paganism, since there are many, many more Christians than there are people who would consider themselves pagans. So I feel like if you don't put your voice out, then it'll get drowned out. So anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now. So thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe, and recommend my content if you haven't already. And you guys obviously can find me on Twitter. I'm also on Gab. And I haven't made an Odyssey channel yet, but it will here eventually, I think. So yeah, thanks for watching. Appreciate you guys hanging out for a couple hours, and you'll have a good one.